In today's episode, I had the privilege of sitting down with retired U.S. Army General Gregg Martin, who served for 36 years. He shares his battle of living with bipolar disorder and the ways it affected his career and personal life.
And essentially, I went into a state of mania for almost the entire year of combat in Iraq.
In a time where bipolar disorder was not easily recognized or diagnosed, and with deep stigmas around mental health, Martin's illness went unnoticed for a long time until he found himself spiraling beyond control. Listen in as we explore the intersections of mental health and military service, learn about bipolar disorder through his personal story, and be inspired by his resilience and courage of triumph over tribulation. Here we go. Gregg.
Great.
Thank you so much for being here on Multispective with me. I really, really appreciate the time that you've taken to be on air with me and, sharing your story with the public.
Well, it's an honor to be here. I really appreciate the invitation, and I'm looking forward to it.
So, Gregg, I have had a chance to read through your novel, your book, your autobiography, and it was just so superbly written. The detail that you have written in this book of yours, it's amazing to me how you've remembered such like small little details, some of which may have been recounted back to you and some of which you yourself can remember. But I think that what you share in this book is something that people need to hear about. And I think that what I loved about your story especially is that you were able to provide such an interesting perspective from all different angles, like coming from you, but from the people that you work with. You threw in little lines about what people were saying to you and how they had viewed you while you were going through your journey as well, and your wife and her involvement and your kids and their perspective. And it's just, I feel like it makes it so important for readers that may be going through something similar to also kind of step out of their own story and view that same story through the eyes or through the lens of other members. So I can't wait to delve into it. And let's start off with you telling me a little bit about where it all begins.
Okay, so it all begins, I grew up in Holbrook, Massachusetts, which is a town near Boston. And right from the beginning, I had, very high energy, drive, enthusiasm, optimism, positivity, creativity, problem-solving skills. And so right from the beginning, that was my personality. And I've recently learned in working with a world famous psychiatrist named Nasir Ghaemi, who teaches at Harvard and Tufts, we basically figured out that I had what they call a hyperthymic personality, which is basically the symptoms are what I just described. And so that personality lifted me and elevated me my whole life up until onset of bipolar disorder in my 40s. So what that means is because I had all this extra dopamine and other powerful chemicals being produced and distributed in my brain, I excelled at everything. My natural talents were enhanced. So in high school, I was captain of the teams. I was top of the class academically. I was in leadership positions. I went to West Point and graduated near the top of my class. Graduated from Army Ranger School. Then went. I was a platoon leader in charge of soldiers, and then a company commander in Germany. And in my off time, I ran 7 marathons, each of them under 3 hours. And then, after working for a full week, we'd leave on a Friday night, friends and my future wife, Maggie, and we'd drive from Germany to Austria, ski all weekend, drive back Sunday night, barely get any sleep, and go to work for another week. And so the reason I share that with you is that was largely driven by my bipolar brain, and that I was living on the bipolar spectrum, and it was giving me an advantage. And, I did very, very well in the Army. And so then the Army said, hey, we want to send you to graduate school at MIT, and your mission is to get a master's in engineering. And so, I not only got 1 master's, I got 2 masters and a PhD. Now, who does that? I mean, I did have talent and ability, but again, I was being elevated by my bipolar brain. And so I continued to serve in the Army, getting top ratings, promotions, prestigious assignments, et cetera. And everything was, I was inching slowly up the bipolar spectrum until my bipolar onset, which we could probably pause and see if you have any questions or comments, because the bipolar onset in 2003 was a significant turning point.
Hmm. Yeah, I mean, you've unpacked a lot over here, and I would definitely like to sort of take this one step at a time. Reading through your book as well, there's so many little tidbits within this journey that you've just sort of summarized for us today, that sort of gave so many tiny little hints that when I was reading it, I was thinking, how was it not picked up over here? Like, how was it that people didn't pick up on it? It wasn't until later on and near the end of the story did I come to realize how you wrapped it up very neatly, that actually people did know, or people did have an idea. I think there was just so many other reasons why no one really brought it up and kind of enforced that seeking treatment or seeking proper help earlier on, because they wanted to encourage your career, or they had a certain sense of respect for you, or they saw the positive sides, the which what you call mania, but in a way was also a very positive energy and a driven sort of personality side that was coming out of you. And, people thought, okay, but, he's providing so much value. So, we can push this aside for now. But for example, when you mentioned that there were signs, even in your mom with the temperamental sort of behaviors, but at that time it was so early on. People didn't know, or people didn't talk about it. It was very stigmatized, the concept of bipolarism or having any sort of mental health issues. To your son coming out, so tell us a little bit about your son, and how did all of that come out to public, and how did you guys learn about it, you and your wife?
So we have three sons, and two of them actually live with and have been diagnosed with bipolar disorder. And both of them had their onset as teenagers, like about junior year of high school. And so the first son, the older one, and he doesn't mind me sharing this at all. He talks openly. Um, he was a junior in high school, and he was, good athlete, good student, doing really well. And then he suddenly fell into this terrible depression. And in aftermath, we found out it wasn't sudden, that this had been building for years in his life, this depression, this, all these bipolar symptoms had been building. But he essentially couldn't get out of bed, couldn't do his work, could barely function, couldn't get dressed. And then one of the telltale signs of suicidality is he started cutting his face. And my wife noticed that. And so that's a clear sign of, that the person is thinking about committing suicide. So we got him in to see medical help, and they started treating him for depression, but then he shot into mania. He bounced out of the depression. He became manic and started teaching himself to play classical music on the piano by himself without any lessons. And he was playing incredibly well. And within a couple months, he was invited to do concerts like at the local church and at his high school. And then he took up painting, and he painted these beautiful landscape portraits. We were living in Pennsylvania in a farm area, and he won awards, art awards, for his beautiful paintings. And then, of course, from the mania, he went back into depression. And so he was in a bipolar cycle, and he was hospitalized. And then, so he really didn't finish his junior year of high school, but we were
Mm,
able to stay stabilized in Carlisle, Pennsylvania. And then, working with his teachers and his guidance counselors and all that, we were able to help him make it through his senior year in high school. So he graduated, and he's done well. He graduated from college. He served in the Army for 8 years. He's done a lot, but the bipolar disorder has, really made life very challenging for him, and a
mm,
struggle, and everything's hard. And,
yeah.
in the suicidality, which is very common in bipolar, people with bipolar, that has continued to plague him as well. But, he's doing reasonably well, but life is hard. And
Mm,
the third son is a little bit younger. He's about 5 years younger, but uh, not quite the same story, but kind of similar. he was first in depression, and then he started going into mania, and then they diagnosed him with bipolar disorder. And he too has made it through college. He got a master's degree, but life has been hard.
Yeah. Can you tell, like, for our listeners that may not have ever heard of it or don't know too much about it, can you tell us what is the depressive state, the mania state, the hypermania? Can you just explain it to our listeners?
Sure. So, inside the wiring of the brain for a healthy person, everybody needs the brain to produce and distribute various biochemicals in order to have a stable mood and for your brain to be stable. And the principal one is dopamine, but also endorphins and other of these biochemicals. So when your mood and your mental health is just in a healthy zone, your brain is producing and distributing just about the right amount of these chemicals. But when you have bipolar disorder, it's a disease of the brain, an illness of the brain. The brain does its own thing independent of what you need for your health. So when the brain decides it wants to go into mania, it starts producing and distributing excess amounts of dopamine, endorphins, and other chemicals. And that drives the brain and the person up into mania.
Hmm.
And then on the other hand, when you go into depression, the brain produces and distributes too little of these chemicals. And then the brain starts to shut down and you go into depression.
Right.
And so mania is where you go quite high to very high in your mood state. And there's various symptoms: grandiosity, religiosity, recklessness, flight of ideas, pressured, continuous talking, um, spending large amounts of money, making really irrational decisions, hyper amounts of energy, enthusiasm, and then either extremely happy and jolly and euphoric, or very angry, full of rage and mean
Mm.
spirited. It could be either of those flavors. And then of course, hypomania is also mania, but a much lower level. So it's a low level of mania. And then depression is you lose all interest in things. You have no energy, no enthusiasm. Nothing appeals to you anymore. You're confused, disoriented, withdrawn, can't make a decision. Um, Oftentimes, you either sleep continuously or you can't sleep at all. You eat continuously or you don't eat at all. That's typical of depression.
Right. That's really interesting. Um, and is it possible that both of them can happen more or less like, I wouldn't say in tandem, but like, say, within the span of one day? Is it possible for a person to go through those cycles within one day, depressive and mania?
Yes, and that's called rapid cycling. When you're shooting from mania to depression quickly within hours or days. And I had some of that. For me, most of what I had were relatively lengthy periods of mania. And then I had mostly short periods of depression until 2014, when I went into a 2 year long depression, which was horrible. But so the rapid cycling, I had that as well.
Right. And that must have been really confusing for anyone and everyone around you, and especially in the position that you were in, the level of decision making that you had to make within your career, the respect that you had within your job. Um, Walk me through that.
Well, y- you know, I was creeping towards bipolar onset for years, for decades. So by the time I was in my 40s, I was pretty much just sub bipolar level. I mean, I was almost at the verge of being bipolar. And the reason that the spectrum idea is so important is, um, you don't suddenly flip a switch and suddenly you have bipolar disorder. And before that, you didn't have it. It doesn't work that way. There's actually a theory called kindling. Like when you think about building a fire when you're out camping, you put like some leaves and then some little twigs and some bigger
Right.
twigs, some little sticks, some bigger sticks, a little log, a bigger log. And that's how bipolar disorder works. You basically creep your way up that line. So by the time I was in my 40s, I was pretty close to bipolar disorder. I was, pretty close to having real mania. But what really happened, the change was that during the Iraq War, where I was a brigade commander in charge of thousands of soldiers in combat, in really ferocious warfare, it was simultaneously, it was thrilling, it was terrifying, it was euphoric, it was traumatic, it was stressful, it was all of those things rolled into one. And so, what that experience did in 2003 is it triggered my genetic predisposition for bipolar disorder. And essentially, I went into a state of mania for almost the entire year of combat in Iraq. And what that meant was suddenly I had this huge surge of energy. Jenica, you already know like how energetic I was, but now multiply that times, 10, 20, 30 times. I had
Mm.
so much energy. I was so enthusiastic. My brain was working so fast. I was rapidly solving all these complex, unexpected problems, under
Mm.
fire on the battlefield, that were life and death decisions. Didn't need sleep. And so I felt like Superman, like I could do anything. And, I
Mm.
moved all over the battlefield, checking on the soldiers and checking on the missions and all that kind of thing. And so I think people were amazed, but, we were in combat. So everybody kind of changes when you're in combat. And then once we settled down from the big attack to Baghdad into, guerrilla warfare and counterterrorism warfare and all that, and we started living and training on these big base camps, so we weren't on the move on the battlefield continuously. Then I started dipping into short bouts of depression, just little, not
Mm.
big, not that long, but when I would have them, I would really feel kind of sick to my stomach and I would suddenly feel very indecisive. I would feel confused. I wouldn't want to be around people, and it might only last a few hours. But I think people, and I would generally try to get away from people, and I think it confused the people that I worked with because I normally was so energetic and high speed and on the move that I think it kind of confused them a bit. But
Right.
after the year in Iraq, this is where there was a huge change. So I had a full year of almost continuous mania. And, everybody got to know me in that state, being, high energy, manic. And then when we got home to Germany, which was our home base, the thrill and the stress and the pressure of war behind me, I fell into depression. And I was in a depressed state for 10 months and was terrible. And so people who knew
Mm.
me in the high energy mode, I think were confused and didn't know what to make of me in my low energy, depressed state. So I think it was confusing for them. And then remember, my bipolar disorder was unknown, unrecognized, undiagnosed. For the next 11 years, I went into higher and higher levels of mania, lower and lower levels of depression, more of the rapid cycling. And I think people probably, they loved, most of the time when I was, in a low to moderate state of mania, they loved that. But when I was too high or I was depressed, they found it troubling, I think.
Right. Can you tell me about the promotions that you had during the mania phase? You talked about, your energy levels being so high and that being appreciated by people seeing such great potential in you. And where did you go from what position to what position within that span of that 1 year that you were on the field?
Okay, so in I got promoted to full colonel, and then I was made a brigade commander, and that's in charge of thousands of soldiers. And that was in like 2001. I got promoted to colonel, and in 2002, I took over my brigade in Germany. And so I was still a colonel, and we trained and prepared like you really worked hard to get ready to go to the Iraq War. Um, I mean, just loads of training, rehearsals, preparation, logistics, maintenance, medical readiness, administration. And then we had to deploy all of our equipment from Germany to Kuwait. Then we got our equipment, and then we trained even more in the Kuwaiti desert. And then we, launched in March of 2003. We launched the attack. So I was a colonel then, and then when we came back from Iraq and I was in Germany, I continued as a colonel. Um, and then a year later, 2005, I got promoted to one-star general. So I was a brigadier general in 2005. And then 3 years later, I got promoted to two-star general. And so that was in 2008. And then that was all the promotions I got. And I ended up retiring as a two-star general. But I mean, the reason they promoted me was, my performance was great. I mean, I was working for four-star generals, super performance. I mean, I was considered a transformational leader. They could give me, it didn't matter what mission or what job they gave me, I would, get it done and have really high morale in the unit. People were happy and they liked coming to work and all that. So basically, my performance was really good. And then they also looked for promotion at your potential. And I mean, I had done all the right jobs, all the hard jobs. I had a PhD from MIT. I was funny, the life of the party, and so had the personality and the personal skills. So I got promoted. And, it's conceivable I could have continued to get promoted had I not been, removed from command because I was in full blown mania and had essentially gone off the rails in 2014.
Right. Can you talk to me about like leadership, um, leadership with bipolar disorder? And the reason I say this is because, like, when you talked about being in the state of mania, you had grandiose ideas, or you had really high expectations from yourself, and you were trying to, like, you were high performing because you were expecting a certain kind of like result. Did that also sort of like spread onto, or onto the rest of your team? Did you have like maybe grandiose ideas for your team? Did you have expectations that were maybe not very achievable by your team as well? What was it like being a leader with this when you were in mania?
Excellent question. I would say early on, as I was going up through my career, and I had this hyperthymic personality or a continuous state of low level mania, and then as my mania increased, I think it helped me as a leader a lot. And I think in Iraq, it helped me a lot. And it helped me for several more years of my time with bipolar disorder because it gave me hyper focus on the mission. I was really engaged with my people. I was really interested in them. I got to know them, not only at work, but, learned about their family, what their hobbies were, what their interests were, what their goals were. And I worked very, very hard to develop and advance and enhance my subordinates. And that was hugely appreciated and respected. And I spent lots of time developing my junior subordinate leaders. I mean, we did all kinds of things. We would do off-site leadership events. We would play all kinds of sports together. We would go on, hikes in the woods. We would do battlefield staff rides where we studied ancient battlefields. We had parties where we just got together and, the spouses came and, we danced and sang karaoke and had fun. And so I think my mania helped me, and I had so much energy and my brain was operating so fast and rapidly and could just pierce through the fog and the problems and see clearly what the solutions were. And I was a very extroverted personality. So we had like good team chemistry. So I think that was all very positive for a number of years until the mania started going too high. And then I was over the top. My enthusiasm was too much. My energy
Mm.
was too much. I had too many ideas. I talked too fast. I started, forgetting things because my brain was going so fast. I started drinking more and more alcohol after duty because when I was manic, it would make me want to drink alcohol because it felt good. And then the
Mm.
more you would drink, the more manic you would get. I also had this grandiosity where, I actually believed I was Superman. I believed I was the smartest guy in the world. I believed I held the key to world peace. Um,
Mm.
and that started getting, out of control. And then this idea called religiosity, I started, believing that I was God's apostle to transform the U.S. military. I started going to, 20, 30 significant religious events per week, which was way over the top. I started having hallucinations that I saw the Holy Spirit come down, that devils and demons were attacking our house. And then I put Bibles and crucifixes in the windows and doors. And then I saw the demons fly and then see the Bible and turn around and do a U-turn. And and I started, and your question was, did I expect too much of my people? And I think that's a brilliant question because the answer is yes. I worked in my last job from which I got fired. The chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, wonderful guy, probably saved my life. He hired me and then fired me. And he gave me, and I had worked for him three or four other times, and he gave me big missions to transform these institutions, hard tasks. And
Mm.
I just said, yes, we can do it, not a problem. And so I had these big, grandiose plans for transformation that were too big. They were too much in the amount of time I had. So in 2 years at National Defense University, the chairman said I probably made a decade's worth of change in just 2 years, which was incredible, except I alienated people. I pushed too hard. I was too demanding. I wanted too
Mm.
much too fast. And that was driven by my manic brain because I thought anything was possible. I can do it. I don't need sleep. I can think through these problems. So if I can do it, why can't you all do it too? And I'm dealing with normal human beings who are talented and smart, but who are not bipolar, and they didn't have these chemicals surging through their brains, making them feel like Superman. So I think at the end, the bipolar disorder hurt me as a leader. Even though it had helped me for year after year, it hurt me for the reasons that I just stated.
Right. Do you reckon though, like if you'd had it and you'd been diagnosed earlier and you were sort of like managing it, maintaining it, taking medications just to like, just to keep it at bay to an extent, that you if you had that ability to control that level of mania that you experienced so that you were able to, push yourself, but at the same time not cross over that sort of like brink, that line that you like that it could have actually worked out for you in your favor, because maybe that level of energy that you had inside of you because of it was what got you so far. It was the tipping point was when, when it just started to get worse and worse because there was not enough treatment. There was no diagnosis. Right.
I think you're exactly right. When I had my onset in 2003 in Iraq, remember it went 11 years undiagnosed, unknown, unrecognized. Nobody knew I had it, including me, until 2014 when I went so manic, full blown mania, that I was removed from command, resign or you're fired.
Yeah.
And then I spiraled and crashed into horrible depression. And remember, I was diagnosed, I was evaluated 3 times in that some July of 2014. And all 3 times they said, hey, you're fine, no problem, fit for duty. And then when I really went into severe depression in November of 2014, then I recognized there's something wrong with me.
Mm.
My brain is sick because the depression was so bad, so horrible, I could barely function as a person. And
Mm.
so I knew there was something wrong. I didn't know I had bipolar disorder, but I went to the doctors and said, hey, there's something wrong. And then they were able to connect the dots to
Right.
my previous levels of high energy and all that. And they were able to then say, aha, you have bipolar disorder, type 1,
Right.
with psychosis, which are delusions and hallucinations. So
Yeah.
I think you're right. If it had been um, seen earlier and put on, I think they call it prophylactic regime of medication, something that could have, you know, kept it from going up too high or going down too low, something like lithium, which has worked well for me. I think it's entirely possible that I could have performed very, very well. I would have been a lot like I am right now. Like right now, I'm my old hyperthymic personality of near continuous low level mania is
Mm.
back. I mean, this is me. This is how I am. This is how I always was prior to going off into extreme levels of bipolarity.
Right. That's so interesting. Can you talk to me about triggers? Because from what I understood in your book, there were certain external stressful situations that triggered you to go into mania and to go into depression. And I found it really, really interesting how there were some scenarios, the situations that you were put in that could have very easily gotten you to switch from a mania to a depressive state. But in certain situations, it didn't. And in other situations, it did. In the same respect, there were scenarios where you were really strongly advocating. I can't remember what it was. It was some leadership um, position, and you were at an event and you were inappropriately talking about your opinions about who should be the leader. And when you were called out on it the next day, even though you were in a state of extreme mania, you still had the ability to control yourself, apologize, ask for forgiveness, and promise that you were not going to do it again. Whereas in other situations, when you were in a state of mania, there was no controlling you, there was no stopping you. And so the way that I was kind of when I was reading it, I was just very intrigued by how certain things triggered manias and depression, and certain things were not that you would have thought would have.
Yeah, that's a really, really good question. I think one of the things that was a help for me, and I talk about it in the book, I think serving in the Army both helped me and hurt me in terms of my bipolarity. The way it helped me is the Army's got a structure and has rules and regulations, and you have to show up at a certain time and do certain things. And so that structure kind of helped me for years to keep me inside the white lines so that I didn't go too wild.
Hmm.
At the same time, it helps you prevent you from going into depression as easily too, because you may be very depressed and you may barely be able to get out of bed, but you say, I have to get up. I'm a soldier. I have to show up at that formation. I have to be there. I got to go to this meeting. And so the structure can kind of um, prevent mania and prevent depression up to a certain point. But the other thing about the Army is that it's stressful. I mean, it's high stress. I mean, you're preparing for war, you're deploying for war, you're in combat. There's pressure all the time to be ready, ready, ready to go. And I think that fuels the manic side. But you gave that example in the book when I had been at a dinner with my wife and was expounding on my opinion on who should be the next top leader in the military. When that gentleman confronted me the next night, he was a retired four-star general, and I think you're not when you're manic, you're not like jumping up and down all the time, bouncing off the walls. You have periods where you're calm, collected, can speak very articulately. Because remember, I'm engaging on a daily basis in my mania with members of Congress, CEOs of industry, four-star generals. and so on and so forth, the media, scholars from universities. And so I'm having perfectly good conversations with them, interspersed with the crazy stuff, the madness and the insanity. But I think what happened when that evening, when General Schwartz, he confronted me, I think it was, whoa, here's a retired four-star general who I know and respect, and he's a big guy. I mean, he's a pretty powerful authority, big authority, and he's
Mm.
like, General, I want to talk to you outside. I think I went, whoa, what's this about? And then I went out there, and he's like, it was totally inappropriate. You should not have been discussing that. The only person who has any business talking about that decision is the Secretary of Defense, and the only person he can be speaking to is the President of the United States. Do you understand that? And I mean, I knew he was ready to make a phone call and get me fired. I mean, that was clear as a bell. And so I think it gave me pause. It brought me down to earth. It pulled me out of my mania and said, whoa, this is serious. I better pay
Mm.
attention to this guy and, give him, total respect so I don't get fired. And so I did. I told him, and I was lucky I already knew him, because I said, hey, sir, you're totally correct. I was way out of line. I apologize. It was unprofessional. I'll never do it again. But if you want to call and get me fired, I totally respect that. I deserve it. And then, he had mercy on me and was a good guy. But I think his position of authority was probably it. And the same thing when I was dealing with my boss, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, General Dempsey, who wrote the foreword to the book. Um, when I would engage with him, I mean, I was on target. I mean, completely together, completely coherent, very smart, very insightful, able to take and say, hey, sir, here's the mission that you gave me to transform the university. Here's where we're at right now. Here's what we've done. Here's what I'm doing right now. Here's the next steps, et cetera. What guidance do you have for me? How would you like me to adjust it? And he'd be like, man, Gregg, that's awesome. That's really great. You're doing a super job. Just keep going. And it wasn't until my full blown mania where he realized there's a problem, and then he ended up removing me. So I don't know, Jenica, if that answers the question.
Yeah, it definitely does. Let me extend this question to maybe someone else that may be potentially worried that they may be going through this. Because I suppose you may have read about this before in the past, with your kids having it and then you having it, maybe wanting to like know a little bit more about triggers in general. What are typical triggers for people that may be having bipolar or maybe worried that they may have it?
So the triggers either to go into it or to have a relapse or to get into a worse condition than you're already in.
Yeah.
Here's some of the triggers. Um, Lack of sleep. So if you go an extended period with too little sleep, that can be a trigger, and it often is. High stress, very high stress, is oftentimes a trigger. A traumatic event, and it could be, the death of someone you love. It could be, witnessing a murder. It could be, an act of violence perpetrated against yourself. It could be being in a car crash. Any kind of, violent, traumatic event can be a trigger. Um, Drugs and alcohol can be a trigger. So excessive amounts of alcohol or drug use can trigger bipolar disorder. Extreme religious events can trigger bipolar disorder because of the effect they can have, on the mind and the emotions and that kind of thing. Um, let's see, what are some other ones? I think those are the main ones.
Yeah, that's so interesting. And again, this all has to be someone with a predisposition for it. So potentially genetic or, hereditary.
Yes. Yeah. So, like, scientists now, although they have not been able to find the specific genetic marker, they believe that it is genetically based. And so what the best science today says is that you either have the gene for bipolarity or you do not have it. In my case, I had it from the time, I was born. And it took, so I had it. I had a bipolar brain. I was on the bipolar spectrum, but it took until 2003 when I was 47 years old in combat in Iraq before it was triggered.
Right.
Now, I could have conceivably gone my whole life without it ever having been triggered. Like maybe if I hadn't been in the army and I had a less stressful job and I didn't go to war, maybe it never would have been triggered.
Interesting.
So you can have the gene and not be triggered. Um, so
Yeah, that's really, really interesting. Can you talk to me about PTSD? You mentioned it very, very briefly in your book, but PTSD is a very common thing for someone who's, been in army in the war. You were diagnosed, were you at any point for potentially having PTSD?
yeah, I was diagnosed in November of 2014 when I finally went to the doctors and they examined me and they got the right stuff. The big thing was bipolar disorder type 1, and that means mania, big mania and depression. So bipolar 1, that was the big elephant in the room or in my brain. Number 2 was psychosis, which is a combination of hallucinations and delusions, which I can talk about because I had really serious psychosis. And then, thirdly, what they called mild to moderate PTSD. So not that bad. I have had PTSD incidents and flashbacks. I have had them, but
Hmm.
not a continuous state of these really bad PTSD symptoms. And then
Right.
I also have anxiety disorder, which I think lots of people have, which means, anxious, nervous, worried. But the big things that I've been treated for are bipolar and psychosis.
Right. Talk to me about the psychosis.
Oh boy, psychosis is it's about 50% of people with bipolar disorder also have accompanying psychosis or psychotic features. So, somewhere along the line, I think it started in Iraq, I started having just little delusions that people were out to get me. They were plotting behind my back. They wanted to get me fired. They wanted to get me kicked out of the army. And then those delusions grew until by 2014, I had a full blown delusion that people were spying on me, wearing a wire, videotaping me. They're watching the house. They were uh, basically documenting evidence against me to get me arrested for crimes against the government and the army. Then they want to see me get tried, convicted, put in jail, where I would be, beaten to death and murdered in prison. And so I had this complete delusion of this
Paranoia.
story in my mind, and
Right.
that's an example of psychosis. And then so that was a severe paranoid delusion that continued for years and got worse. But then there was a hallucination that went with it, and the hallucination was I saw, felt, smelled, and heard myself in jail. It was real, where I was incarcerated and I was beaten terribly, and then I was stabbed to death, and I died in a pool of my own blood, gurgling, and I died on a prison floor. And that was real, continuously in my mind. And so a delusion is believing something to be true that is empirically provable to not be true.
Hmm.
And a hallucination is sensory. It's seeing, hearing, feeling, smelling, tasting something to be real that is, in fact, it's not real. It's not there. So I had this thing in prison. I had another one of this invisible force grabbing me and throwing me underneath an 18-wheeler truck. And I got ripped apart. My arms, legs, head thrown off to the side. And I had hallucinations that I could fly. I had multiple times when I felt myself flying. I told you about seeing the demons and the Holy Spirit. Um, I had you know, one of the things that I had one time when I had a PTSD attack, I had hallucinations that I was back in Iraq getting attacked, bombs going off, bullets, artillery, fires, smoke, people screaming, dead bodies. And so that was a PTSD driven hallucination. And I had other hallucinations that people who were resisting me at the university, who didn't want to change, that their faces morphed into snakes and rats. And that was a hallucination. And I'm really lucky that, when you have these kind of dangerous, disturbing hallucinations, it would have been very easy to like grab the person and throw them out a window or take a chair and smash them over the head. And I'm really
Mm,
lucky that I never snapped like that and did anything, against the law or violent.
right. And you didn't have any awareness that what you were seeing was out of the ordinary. Like at that point, you genuinely believed those hallucinations. Like this is as real as it gets. I'm not like didn't even question those things that you saw.
Yes. Yeah. It just seemed, it was, it was startling. It was disturbing. Um, it's kind of weird, but
Yeah.
it was as real could be. And I've talked to lots of psychiatrists, some of the experts in the world, and they said that when you're in that state, your brain, it's real in your brain. It is a real thing. Even
Right.
though it's not real, it's real in your brain, and your brain processes it as being real and responds to it as being real.
Right. And so when all of this was happening, was there somebody that you were talking to or told about what you saw, or did anyone see you reacting to those hallucinations in any way?
I think there were the one when I had the PTSD flashback where I thought there were bombs going off and I was back in Iraq. I think people were startled because I jumped up and I started yelling, "Go, go, go!" Like as if we were, in combat. And I'm telling the troops, "Go forward, go!" And I think people are like, "Whoa!" But nothing ever came of it. And then like nobody ever reported me and said, "Man, we think General Martin's losing it." And then the other thing is when you're in a state of mania, which remember I was in mostly mania up until I went into the horrible depression of 2014.
Hmm.
You don't think there's anything wrong because you generally feel really great and you're super confident and you're all pumped up and enthusiastic and happy. And um, And so, no, I never talked to anybody. I didn't think there was something wrong. I wasn't alarmed at what I was
Mm,
seeing and hearing and thinking. I just thought it was reality, the way it is.
yeah. I found it interesting that when you were in your state of depression in 2014 is when you realized that something was wrong. However, when you were in those states of mania, which was majority of your time, that you were being stopped, like your wife had stopped you a couple of times and told you to like calm down and like you're overreacting to things, that it still didn't trigger as like something's wrong here. But again, yeah, I understand that because you were in a state of euphoria. You were feeling like everything is great, everything is good. So why would you question or check into your mental health state at that point, right?
Right.
So can you tell me about the working outside of it, because oh my gosh, like the number of things that you did during your mania in terms of your physical state, the workouts, the running, the cycling, the tell us about that.
Okay. Um, yeah. So, I've always been, very athletic and, a workout. People would call me a workout madman. And so I love physical exercise. And for years, I got runner's high until I had to stop running because my joints were pretty much worn out. Unfortunately, that happened. But so I'll, so in high school, I was on track and cross country and played basketball, and I was running and playing sports, 3, 4, 5, 6 hours every single day. And then at West Point, you were working out every day, playing sports, doing physical education. I was on varsity track, did triathlon. And so, again, hours of working out. And then when I was out in the Army as a young officer, as a lieutenant in Germany. I lived on a farm about 4 hours from the little army base I was stationed at. So I would wake up early in the morning, like 4 o'clock, do farm chores, eat a little breakfast, and then run 4 miles through the woods into work. Then I would meet the troops in my platoon and take them on PT, and we'd run more miles and do push-ups and pull-ups and weightlifting. And then, so that was like hours of workout before we even started work. And then at lunchtime, I would play basketball with the troops and lift weights. And then at the end of a long work day, I would put my backpack back on and run back through the woods to the farm, do more work on the farm, eat, and then go out and party that night. And so it was unbelievable. And I continued that kind of really intense PT schedule. It may have slowed down a little bit, but I kept that up for pretty much for years and years, well into my 40s, even into my 50s. And so when I was manic, though, like at National Defense University, for example, where I was from 2012 to 2014, so that was my peak mania. That was when I got fired, forced to retire, and all that stuff.
Mhm.
So I would wake up early in the morning with virtually no sleep, and my only calm time is I would take a cup of coffee and I would go out the third story roof and watch the sunrise, and I would pray and meditate and study the Bible and do some like religious meditation stuff, and then I would see the sunrise and then go down, and I would go out and either ride my bike or power walk for at least an hour or more, and then I'd go lift weights, and I'd do stretching and things like that. Then I'd take a shower, have breakfast, go to work, and I would work, and then I would have various times during the workday when I would leave the office, leave the building, and I would grab a couple people or ask them to come with me, and we would power walk around this beautiful little army base called Fort McNair, which is has two rivers around it. I mean, it's just gorgeous, the Anacostia River and the Potomac River Channel. And so we would do these meetings on the move, and I'd have people brief me as we were walking around the base. And like I thought that was good for us because we were getting exercise. But I mean, that was probably a bit extreme. And then
Yeah.
after work, I'd work all day. I'd come home, drink a beer, then I'd go out and I would work out again. And then, so I would, do more power walking, or I'd go to the gym and do the elliptical, or I'd ride a stationary bike. I'd lift more weights, then come home and have, more alcoholic drinks, eat dinner. And then people would come over to the house and we would talk about strategy, about how to transform. These are people who really supported me and wanted to implement the changes. And then I would do emails and read and study, and I'd be sending emails and text messages, you know, into the early morning hours, like from 10, 11 at night till 12, 1, 2 in the morning. I'd send hundreds of email and texts, which was really a sign of mania. I mean, that's not good. That is not a good thing to do.
Mm.
And then I would try to go to sleep, but I couldn't sleep because I was so manic. And I would basically go back out again, and I would typically either go out and walk around the army base, or I jump on my bike and go for a bike ride, late at night all around Washington, D.C. And that's when I had this really awesome hallucination that I would come down from Capitol Hill where the Congress works, and I would go down the hill as fast as I could. There were no cars or anything because it was so late at night, 1, 2, 3 in the morning, and that I would lift up off the ground and I would be flying. Another time was also when I was in full blown mania. I was on a ferry boat down in North Carolina, and I was riding in the boat, and I hallucinated that I lifted up off the boat and was flying above the boat watching it. And then I had the experience in Ranger School, which was early, I was only about 23. And essentially, and I wrote about it in the book, where we were climbing this mountain ridge in the winter middle of the winter with snow and ice. We were food and sleep deprived at Ranger School. And I lifted up out of my body and hallucinated that I was up above me and the other guys, and that I looked down at myself walking, and that there was a bubble with a plate of hot spaghetti and meatballs, because I was dreaming
Nice.
about food because I was so hungry. And so
Right.
those were the three experiences with, out of body experiences.
Damn. That's crazy. And you would have thought that, like, with all of that exercising and exerting your physical body, that even in like that would have like somewhat maybe helped you with managing the mania and would help you get some sleep, which would then in turn, like, help with the manic phases. But it wasn't. It would happen day after day, day after day, like absolutely like zero exhaustion in your body. Did you ever try to get yourself like checked for, like, why is it that I have just so much energy? Like, when am I ever going to get sleep? Like, what I mean is like the physical sense. Did you ever go to the doctor to, get medication for sleep to help you with sleep, or any of the other physical symptoms you were experiencing?
Great question. So three different times, after Iraq, three times I went to the doctors when I was in a state of depression. And I went in and told the doctors, and this was in 2004 twice, and then in 2011. I went in and I told the doctor, look, I feel really terrible. I'm usually high energy, all that. I'm depressed. I don't have any energy. I'm indecisive. I'm confused. I'm withdrawn. What's wrong with me? And they basically said, two times they said, you're fine, there's nothing wrong, which of course they were just completely wrong. I was in the depressive phase of a bipolar cycle. And then
Mm.
the third time they said, oh, you have they tested me for a sleep disorder, and they said, you have sleep apnea. And so, I got one of those sleep machines, and that was kind of the end of all that. As a general officer, you get a complete physical every year, and I did tell the doctors, hey, I feel really, even when I was in mania, I felt stressed out. Uh, I would have periods where I felt tired, and so forth. And they said, well, you're just in a really high stress job. There's a lot of pressure on you. You've described how people aren't supporting your mandate for change. So, all your signs are healthy. So just hang in there, try to get a little more sleep, try to relax, don't take it quite so seriously. And they really just kind of downplayed the whole thing. And
Mm.
I, again, because of the mania, I thought I was an apostle from God, put in these jobs to do God's will, to
Right.
transform the military. I mean, I believe that. And so the fact that I wasn't sleeping, I just said, well, that's God giving me this superpower that I don't need sleep. And so I have more time to work on the job. Because, and again, I thought, God is like he has anointed me and given me these superpowers to do his mission. And I totally, 100%, Jenica, believed that. And so this stuff didn't alarm me or cause me a problem. And the
Mhm.
interesting thing about no sleep, I basically figure I went about 3 months in the spring, summer of 2014 with near zero sleep, like really near zero. And what happened is and of course I was winding my way towards total exhaustion. It ultimately would have caught up with me. But when you don't get sleep, it drives your mania up. And as your mania goes up, you need less sleep. And so it's a vicious cyclone to the bottom. And that's
Right.
what happened.
Wow. Man, like that's so scary though. Like, if only there was someone there to pick up on that lack of sleep, that in itself can be such a concerning thing to experience, family members seeing, okay, like, how is it that I'm sleeping, he's awake, he's still going for an exercise. I wake up in the morning, he's wide awake, like he never fell asleep. You know, at that very moment, was there anyone like your wife or your kids noticing, or even coworkers noticing that, okay, at least like try to get some sleep, like you need some sleep?
So when I was in the extreme phase, that three month or so where I wasn't getting any sleep, my wife, she goes to bed early and sleeps soundly till the morning, and so she didn't know that I was getting up and going out on late night bike rides. I mean, she didn't
Right.
know that, and and of course she never saw me at work, so. The thing that started to alarm her was during that period when I started getting more and more kind of out of control. Um, and I gave examples in the book about that. My youngest son was living at home with us. He was going to college in Washington D.C., and so he started noticing, the crazy hours, the PT,
Mm,
the manic behavior, and so he saw that something was wrong. But at the same time, the people at work began to see things were wrong, but it all happened in a relatively condensed period that my manic behavior got so extreme, so out of control that then people started realizing, whoa, there's something really wrong here.
mm,
And of course that led to my being removed. So it all happened pretty rapidly.
right.
There was a period back in about 2006 when I was the commander of the Northwest Division of the Corps of Engineers. My number two person, so sort of my deputy, um, she came in and said, "Hey, I got to talk to you, General," and said, "I'm going to close the door." And she said, "Look, your falling asleep in meetings is beginning to concern people. You are. It looks like you're not paying attention. It looks like you're not really grasping the material. You're falling asleep, which shows a lack of interest. Like, how much sleep are you getting?" And of course I was only getting at that point in 2006, probably 3 or 4 hours a night, which was pretty typical. And she said, "You've got to get more sleep. You have to
Mm,
get more sleep." So for a while I tried to get more sleep, but I was mostly manic then. It just wasn't full blown mania. It was lower on the spectrum. So in terms of the kindling effect, it was, I mean, I had logs that were burning in terms of mania, but the big bonfire didn't start till 2014.
right.
But I really couldn't sleep more,
Right.
because my brain was so restless with mania that it was just virtually impossible. I couldn't fall asleep. So I'd get up and, I'd read the New York Times or I'd read a book.
Yeah.
And that's what I did at that point.
Interesting. Now, I don't want to get too much into the end of your career as NDU transformation leader, because I want that to be sort of something that the readers read. But can you tell us a little bit about what happened after you'd retired completely? You were in before that in a sort of state of mania, and then having nothing to do anymore. What was that like for you after you'd retired?
Yeah, so it was it, everything came together in this vortex where I had, full blown mania, a raging bonfire in terms of the kindling theory. I pretty much got fired from my job, forced to retire, and then, when they said three times that you're fit for duty and there's nothing wrong with you, then that validated in my mind this conspiracy theory, these paranoid delusions. Then I said,
Yeah.
"Aha! See, they really were out to get me. They did get me fired. And then they're going to come and arrest me, and then I'm going to lose all my pay and benefits. And then I'm going to get murdered in jail." So my mania turned from, sort of happy, uh, enthusiastic mania to angry, bitter, full of rage. And then I spiraled into terrible depression. And that started my 2 year journey of bipolar hell, which it really was hell. And so I finally got diagnosed in November of 2014. A few months later, I retired from the Army. No continuity of care plan, which was terrible DOD has since changed it, and everybody with a mental condition has a tight continuity of care plan where they get hooked up with a civilian provider or the VA. But anyway, I went out and we moved to New Hampshire where we had a house. And then I went from bad to worse. It really
Mm.
got drastically worse. The depression got worse. The psychosis got worse. The everything, the paranoia, delusions, the whole 9 yards. And all I wanted to do was die. I would at night, the happiest time of the day, the only time that was even remotely happy was going to bed at night. And I'd say, please, I don't want to wake up in the morning. Just let me die in my sleep. And I don't get up. And then every day was misery. It was terrible. And then finally, after about a year up there, um, and I wasn't answering texts, phone calls, emails. I was just completely secluded.
Mm.
I had one thing. I had a friend who would invite me over to his house and we'd drink beer and smoke cigars. And then one other friend who occasionally would take me out on a boat ride. But other than that, my wife and this battle buddy friend, army friend of mine, they worked together to get me into a VA or Veterans Administration hospital nearby. It was in Vermont, but it was very good. They had a really good psychiatric department. So they
Mm.
worked to get me an appointment because I wouldn't have done anything on my own. I just would have, laid on the floor and ruminated and hoped to die.
Mm.
And so we went up there. I got an appointment. We went up there to the hospital, and the head of the psychiatry department, he interviewed me, and the typical questions: Are you suicidal? And I wasn't. I didn't want to kill myself, but I wanted to die. And then he said, do you have any morbid thoughts of death or dying? Which is the first time anybody ever asked that question. And I said,
Mm.
yes. And I told him the story about that I just told you a few minutes ago about getting murdered in jail and about the invisible force throwing me under the 18-wheeler. And
Mm.
he said, whoa, those are passive suicidal ideations where you're hallucinating about your own death, and they're very dangerous because they can transform into active ideations, which then can lead to an active plan to kill yourself and commit
Right.
suicide. So he said, you need to stay here with us. So I went 2 weeks in the inpatient ward, which was very good, multidisciplinary team, very good treatment. But I also got electric shock therapy called electroconvulsive therapy, but
Mm.
it didn't help me. But I spent 6 weeks in the hospital, and I came out, but I wasn't better. I went right back into depression, more hallucinations. And it wasn't until 6 months later that my wife Maggie called the doctor and said, hey, you got to try something stronger. So we
Mm.
agreed to try lithium. And Jenica, within 3 to 4 days of taking lithium, my depression vanished. My
Mm.
psychosis went away. And that was 7 years ago. And we moved to Florida. And essentially, that was the lithium gave me my life back. And I
Right.
take lithium every day, which is it's a natural salt that is harvested out of the earth. But it basically created a roof and a ceiling. So my brain can't go into mania because it hits the roof of lithium puts, and I can't go into depression because it hits the floor. And
Right.
so 7 years ago, we moved to Florida, bright, sunny, warm, which is very good for the brain chemistry. And I've essentially, rebuilt my life. And it now, at this point, I'm living, a wonderful, purposeful life, witness the book and all that. But anyway, there's a lot that is packed into those 7 years of
Right.
recovery. So I'll pause there and did I answer the question? And what
Yeah,
other
you
thoughts?
did, and more too. I'm curious, is lithium something that your sons took as well?
They both tried it for various periods of time. And the problem with lithium, the good news is it's very effective for some people. The bad
Okay.
news is it has side effects. Like I had a loss of balance, a loss of coordination. I put on probably 5 or 10 pounds. But the lasting disadvantage is tremors in my hands. So the real
Mm.
lasting thing for me is tremors, but it can also damage over time. It can damage your kidneys. And so they check your kidneys routinely. But my two sons didn't have those problems. One of them started losing his hair. And so, that really bummed him out because he had a nice head of hair and he didn't want to lose
Mm.
it. And the other one, it gave him very loose bowels to where he had to go to the bathroom all the time. And that was
Right.
just, he couldn't live with that. And he also, like for me, it hasn't curbed my normal pre-bipolar personality. I have that hyperthymic personality with a lot of enthusiasm and energy. And with the youngest son, who's an artist, he felt that it took away his creativity, his energy, and he didn't
Mm.
like that, and so he stopped taking it.
Right. So, what other kinds of treatments are there? Are there any non-medicated treatments that a person with bipolar can take? Like just therapy, for example?
So there are non-pharmaceutical treatments, natural types of things, and I've heard that for some people those kind of things work, and that's great. More power to them. I mean, I think it's wonderful. Interestingly, lithium is actually a natural solution because it's a salt that comes out of the earth. It's
Right.
it's not a plant or a leaf or anything like that, but it actually is natural. And they process it and turn it into pills. Um, but I have heard that there are, sort of natural, organic approaches, and that some people have had success. I don't know any of those people. I haven't
Mm.
heard, that much about it, but I haven't really researched it either. There are other medications for sure. For generally speaking, lithium is the most effective for bipolar type 1. There's
Mm.
another medication called Lamictal, which is probably the most effective for bipolar type 2, which is a
Interesting.
different flavor of bipolar disorder. But therapy is really important. And I actually have heard of people who have told me that they said, I stopped taking all medication and I do, really deep meditation and I work with a therapist and I'm fine. So I have heard of that. But like in my case, in the case of probably most others, to really have a journey of recovery that's built to last. And I call it a journey, just like the book is named A Forever War, because it never ends. It's a
Mm.
chronic disease that doesn't go away, that you have to
Right.
manage like diabetes or something like that. But you got to get your biochemical balance correct. And for most of us, including me, that means medication.
Right. Yeah, that makes
Then you got
sense.
to do therapy because the therapist can help you so much on how to
Mm.
think and how to deal with problems and how to deal with triggers and how to understand the triggers and how to avoid them. And then thirdly, you have to have a healthy lifestyle, healthy diet, exercise, sleep, plenty
Mm.
of water, low stress. And then those are necessary, but I would say not sufficient, that you have to anchor those into the what I call the social foundation of the 5 Ps, which I think are people. So you got to surround yourself with happy, upbeat, energetic people who make
Mm.
you feel alive and happy. People like you, and then purpose. You have to have a purpose that really drives you. And like mine is sharing my bipolar story to help stop the stigma and save lives. Um, and then place. You have to live in a place that energizes you, that lets you do the things you want to do. And for us, Florida has been great. And then perseverance is the 4th P. This is hard stuff, and you have to really have the will to win and never quit in order to keep your recovery going. And then the
Mm.
5th is presence. It's called thinking about your own thinking, or the fancy word is metacognition. And so what that means is, like, if I start having a little seedling of paranoid delusions that people are thinking bad things and, want to do something bad to me, I get outside of my own head and I think about it. I say, wait a second, who do you think's thinking these bad things about you? Why would they think
Mm,
that? There's no
right.
reason for them. In fact, these people probably aren't thinking about you, Greg Martin, at all. And so that's the power of presence. So anyway,
Right.
that's kind of the recovery journey that I've had. But I think all of them they're all pillars in having a healthy, lasting recovery.
Yeah. And I can imagine that being, I mean, what you've just said now is important for anyone. You don't have to necessarily have bipolar disorder to be able to take that piece of advice and apply that. Like, I was thinking as you were telling us about this, I was thinking about my life. Like, I could definitely, I would definitely be much happier and much more stable in every aspect of my life if I had all of those things in place. And presence, I think, is such an important one. Maybe that's like that internal dialogue that, someone who doesn't have bipolar maybe has a little bit more of that self reasoning. Whereas someone who does have that maybe doesn't necessarily have that ability to kind of like question that train of thought in that very moment when they're experiencing it. But do you reckon, like, after you were diagnosed, you were more aware of it and you were able to stop yourself in your tracks when you started feeling that way or thinking that way? Do you think that diagnosis helped you to sort of be more in the present?
So when I got diagnosed, I was extremely sick. I mean, my brain was really, really sick, and I was in the pits of, bipolar hell. I will say that the day that I went in and the doctor diagnosed me, he was the same doctor who got it wrong in the summer. But I said, "Thank you, doctor." And I gave him a hug and I said, "You have really helped me because I knew there was something wrong and now I know what it is. And now
Mm,
working together, we can, begin to recover." So I was really happy about that. And, but over the next couple of years, my bipolar disorder took me deeper and deeper into bipolar hell. And so
right.
my brain was the chemistry of my brain was so messed up and so out of whack. I didn't have the ability to do the presence aspect of recovery. I really didn't. And I didn't
Yeah.
have the ability to do that until after I started taking lithium.
Interesting. Very interesting. Yeah. Such an incredible journey, Greg. I'm just so amazed by your resilience through it, and through some of the toughest times that you've been able to sort of like sit down with it and actually, like, process it and spread awareness on something that's so important for people to know about. So yeah, I really, really appreciate you sharing that with us today, Greg.
Oh, my privilege, honor, everything. I'm really grateful that you brought me on your podcast. And for all the
Definitely.
listeners out there, I mean, this is what I do. It's my purpose in life is sharing my bipolar story because,
Yeah.
untreated, not just bipolar, but other mental illnesses can lead to devastating results. Destruction of marriage, family, career, finance, can lead to homelessness, addictions, prison, suicide.
Mm.
And that's the bad news with mental illness. But the good news is, if treated properly, and with once you get on that journey of recovery, you can live a happy, healthy, purposeful life, which is really how my life is now. I mean, I'm really happy. I'm really having a great time, telling the story because I really believe it's helping to end the stigma, save lives, promote recovery. And so, Jenica, I'm super grateful that you brought me on.
Definitely. So, one final plug-in, please tell our listeners how they can find you and read and find your book. Where can they buy your book as well? I've read it. I was blown away, and I know our listeners are going to definitely want to get their hands on this book too.
Okay, well, thanks for asking. So the name of the book is Bipolar General: My Forever War with Mental Illness. And probably the easiest way to get to it is to go to my website, which is www.bipolargeneral.com. And if you open my website right away, the book jumps up at you and it gives you the direct link to Amazon, Barnes and Noble, the Naval Institute Press, and others. And but you can also just go straight to any of those distributors. Like if you just go straight to, say, Amazon, you should be able to get it. I will tell you, there was a glitch on the Amazon site. Amazon put out a link a while ago that the link wasn't working correctly, and then they put out a new link. So the only thing you got to be careful of is that you get the proper Amazon link. So if they
Right.
say, if you go to a link and it says the book is not available, the link is bad, because there's plenty of books in distribution. They printed tons of them, and so I would say just go to my website.
Yeah.
And then you also have not only the book, but I've got probably about 25 published articles that are pretty interesting, and then a bunch of podcasts and other things. But anyway, that's the way to do it. Just go to the website, click
Awesome.
on the button.
Yeah, I'll put that into the description as well, so people can like directly click into it from there as well for access. So yeah, thank you so much, General, for that conversation. I can't wait for this episode to be aired for our listeners.
I can't either. That'll be great, and I'll put it on my website, and it'll go out on social media. Because you did such a great job. You're such a great host that I want to make sure people hear it.
If you enjoyed the episode and would like to help support the show, please follow and subscribe. You can rate and review your feedback on any of our platforms listed in the description. I'd like to recognize our guests who are vulnerable and open to share their life experiences with us. Thank you for showing us we're human. Also, a thank you to our team who worked so hard behind the scenes to make it happen.
Chris Trzynski.
Stefan Menzel.
The show would be nothing without you. I'm Jenica, host and writer of the show, and you're listening to Multispective.